Romans chapter 1, verse number 19 and verse number 20. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Let us pray. Father, we thank you and praise you, God, for what you do. Pray that you watch over us, help us to serve you. I pray, God, that you would help us, Lord, just to be faithful to you today. I pray that you would bless, Lord, in the rest of this service, that you'd be honored and glorified. Lord, we thank you for all this, and we ask it in your Son, Jesus' name. Now, just for the context of what we've been talking about in this passage so far, is the fact that God says Himself that there is nobody in this world who is excusable, because everything in creation points to you that there is a Creator. That there's nothing here that says there is not a Creator. In fact, I saw something very foolish recently that somebody had shared something on Facebook, and I don't know how I managed to click the comments on it. I do that sometimes, but this time it was an accident. And the first thing I saw was somebody saying that science would be closer akin to atheism because atheism and science both show that there is no God. And it's like there is no factual science anywhere in the world that points to there not being a God. Everything in science that is observable, testable, factual points to there being a God. The only things that point to there not being a God are the things that somehow cannot be tested, cannot be proven, cannot be held up to any scientific scrutiny whatsoever, and themselves are theories at best. And we've dealt with some of those across the past few weeks. We're going to deal with a few of them today as we go through this. Today, though, I want to stay a little more focused in the Scriptures, because we've talked about the evidence of there being a Creator. We've talked about His fingerprints across all of creation. And we had one very long message that was just an introduction to all of that because I got carried away when I was talking about it. And so we've had all of those things till now. But what I want to look at today is God's power as the Creator. I want to see, because it doesn't say just simply that we can see God in His creation. It says we can see His power in His creation. So we saw last week that it tells us we can see and understand some things about the Godhead by looking at creation and how He has made the universe. That's the last time we were in this passage, I mean. And so the last time we were in this passage, as we looked at that, we saw that, for example, the Trinity is taught to us through nature itself even, as you yourself are a triune being made in the image of God, who Himself is a triune being. He's 3 in 1. And so we looked at how those things are taught in the Bible, and then we showed how that even the world around us shows us that also, and how the Bible tells us that the world around us shows us that. So we've seen those kind of things, but the other half of this idea is that it's not just who God is and His nature that can be seen through His creation. It is His absolute power that can be seen through His creation. So saying that, let's look at some verses that will help us. Of course, the first and the most obvious one we're going to go to is Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. If you can get a hold of this verse, then there is nothing in the Bible that should be hard for you. Nothing else would be hard or complicated for you to understand if we get a hold of this. That in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The reason I say that if you can get a hold of this, God's power will be so evident to you that there will be nothing that should be hard for you to believe, hard for you to understand, hard for you to trust God in. This is the reason why I'm going to be less focused maybe on the evolution versus creation side of things, because I want to spend a little bit of time before I get to any of that helping you as a Christian understand why this is important from a different perspective. Last week we saw it was important because if you don't believe this, you are not truly a Bible believer. If you don't believe that God created, because God said He created, and you can't change His Word to fit your theories, or else you don't believe God, you believe your theories, and you just like God and want to include Him in them. So we saw that, but this time I want to look at something a little bit different in that I want you to understand, and I want to help you appreciate that if you can just wrap your mind around the 3 verses we just read, then there is no trial, no difficulty, no heartache, nothing you will ever face in this life that should be that intimidating to you. Because if God is the one who indeed created the world, then there's nothing in this world that is too hard for Him. If He is the maker of this universe, there's nothing in the universe that you'll ever meet or any challenge that would be difficult. And that's why whenever you come to a passage that's difficult and hard for you to understand, why would God do that? How did God do that? When you read Genesis chapter 1, if you really believe that, it answers those questions for you. How did God do that? Well, God making the sun stand still shouldn't be surprising to you when God made light when there was no sun. God making the sun to stand still when Joshua asked for it shouldn't surprise you when God spoke the universes into existence and stretched them out with His fingertips. Like, none of that should be of any surprise to someone who believes that in the beginning God created. So there's nothing that's too hard for God when you believe that. Like Abraham and Sarah laughing at the idea, or Sarah laughing at the idea of God giving her a child when she's past age. It's not something that's funny if you really believe God created the universe, because if God created the universe, I'm pretty sure it's not a problem for Him to help create life in a womb, something that was already designed to produce that. I understand that it's past age. I understand that it shouldn't be able to do it anymore, but creating something from nothing sounds a lot harder to me than taking something that was already meant to do a job and making it do that job, even though it's not able to do it anymore. You see what I'm saying with that? That when it comes to this idea of God's power as a creator, if you can believe in the beginning God created, then it shouldn't bother you to wonder, can God do this or can He do that? The other side of that is, why does God do certain things? Well, if we believe Proverbs when it says the Lord by wisdom hath created the earth, by understanding hath set it upon its pillars, by knowledge hath filled it with all good things. If we believe that idea that God by wisdom created all of this, and we can see that how thousands of years later, God's plan still flows perfectly. If you don't think that's an answer to your troubles, then you've never read the book of Job. Because after all those chapters of Job trying to understand, God, why would you let this happen to me? You and I can look at the story and understand that the reason God allowed this to happen to Job is because of the fact that God was using Job as a message, as a preacher to everyone who would ever come after him, that man does not serve God for naught. That we don't serve God because of what He has given us, but because of who He is. And we can trust God and serve Him even in the darkest, hardest possible times imaginable. So for you and us, we can read the book and we can get the answer. We can see all the points, all the things pointing to Christ and how that the real meaning and purpose of life is Christ. And there's so many beautiful, wonderful things we can get from Job's life that Job didn't have any of those. Job didn't have those answers that you and I have because he didn't have the rest of Scripture to compare his life to, nor all the recordings and preaching and all the stuff that we have to look at. But what Job did have was an answer from God where God looked at Job and said, were you there when I created the world? Do you understand how any of this stuff works? If not, then why would you think you can understand what I'm trying to do? If you don't understand how the wind blows from the east to the west, you don't understand how I can speak to you through the lightning, you don't understand any of that kind of stuff, then why do you think you would understand why I allow something like this to come into your life? So my point is that Job's answer to his suffering was, if you can see that God has designed creation so intricately, so perfectly, so well that it runs so smoothly as a machine, even after being broken by the fall of man and by sin, then you can trust Him to run your life far better. Like you can trust Him to take your life, which He is renewing and fixing and working in, and trying to fix what sin has done to it. You can trust Him to do much greater things with your life if you can look at this world and see what He created and how perfect His design was. So, I know this is somewhat simplistic, but I want you to make sure you get this today. That one of the greatest things you and I can do as Christians when it comes to creation is to step back and let it show us just how mighty and how wise our God is. Because if we will let it do that, next time your heartache is coming to your life and your trials are coming and things are where you don't understand why it's going like this, you can know it this much. There is a God who is powerful enough to speak the world into existence, that knows exactly what He's doing, and He's completely in control. So now saying that, let's consider what He actually says here. God says that in the beginning He created the heaven and the earth. Do you understand He doesn't say heavens yet? Because He hasn't created the firmament to separate one heaven from another. So He's created the heaven and the earth at this point. That's all there is. The earth itself is without form and void because it's covered in water, and it's only in another couple days that He's going to separate the dry land from the sea, and so then it'll have shape to it beyond just being a ball of water. And so you have this creation wherein God has spoke, and there was nothing. There was not time, there was not space, there was no matter. There was nothing at all, and God created everything from that. Any other religion you believe that tries to justify to you how all this exists has to be able to give an answer. And if you were to believe, for example, the Big Bang Theory as it's taught and as it's presented, you would have to believe that, well, there was a universe before this one, it imploded, it became an infinitely dense ball of mass, that exploded, then it formed our universe, and eventually this one's going to collapse, and it's going to turn into a ball, and then it's going to explode, and it's going to make another universe. But you always will have to trace that logic back to the point where you can give an answer as to where did it begin. And anybody with an ounce of wisdom to their mind can look at that and see that there is no answer to be found in what's taught in most systems of teaching. There is no answer to be found when you say that, okay, I believe that it was an infinitely dense ball of mass that exploded. Before that was the universe, it imploded. Because you're always just going to keep going backwards to the universe before and the universe before and the universe before, and you will never get to a creator. You will never get to a point of origin. With this, we have a definitive point of origin, and that there is a God who, by definition, this is why it's important for you to understand this. The reason why the world has a hard time with believing in God is because they imagine something like the Greeks worshipped, wherein it is a created being who was born from somebody's loins and went forward and did whatever evil things they did. God is not that. God is someone who is so powerful at the sound of His voice, darkness can be made into light. Nothing can be made into something. The absence of time can become time. All of these things can exist simply at the sound of His voice. I mean, you think about what He just said. He spoke and there was light. He didn't create a sun to produce that light, not for a couple more days. He spoke and there was light. Simply at the sound of His voice, there was light, and that was enough. Now, if you study, you'll find that Jesus is the light of the city of New Jerusalem, and I understand all of that. But I want you to notice that it's simply at the sound of His voice, there is light. He doesn't need to create anything to create light. His voice is enough to produce it. So what you have to understand when you look at Jesus Christ and you look at creation and understand how He carried that out is the reason why the world has a hard time with what we present to them is because they can't wrap their minds around the idea of a God of infinite power, one who inhabits eternity and lives outside of time, so that time is nothing to Him, so that there is no power that is limited to Him. The only thing limiting Him is His character and His nature and the things that He will not do. There's nothing that He cannot do. It is simply what He will not do. You understand that when it comes to God, that's His limit. But when you listen to men like Dawkins over in England and other ones who present themselves as very intelligent men, the problem they have with God is they always say, well, where did God begin? Where did He come from? Where is His origin point? And you have men who accept blindly, swallow it fully, completely, this idea that there was a universe and it collapsed and became a ball, and that ball exploded and it became a universe, and that's happened over and over and over again, infinite number of times. They swallow that blindly, never asking, where did the first ball come from? Where did the first universe come from? Never willing to accept it, because even when you press someone, I've heard Dawkins himself, and it's not a message on Dawkins, but I've heard him himself say plainly that we know we don't understand the cosmos, we don't understand the universe. We just accept that one day we'll have somebody who comes along like Darwin, who will give to us a theory that helps us to accept what we already know and explains it to us better. So he says, we're just waiting on our Darwin to come and make it all make sense. But they blindly believe a faith that has no logic, no understanding, no wisdom behind it. There's so many things that show you that it's not correct. And some of these are things I would like to get into later in the message, but you understand that it is impossible for this universe to have existed for millions of years. And it's ironic that this part of the world is the Netherlands, actually, that will try to give an answer to one of the things I would propose to you to consider. But if you've never considered this, the age of a comet is less than about 10, 15,000 or so, 20,000 years, somewhere in that range. It's less than all of that. And so how could a universe that's millions of years old have comets flying around, all freely throughout the universe, and there's nowhere that they're being produced, and yet they all should have faded away millions or billions of years ago. I mean, think about that. Like, you have these things that have a shelf life, they can't exist more than a few thousand years, and yet they're just flying around freely out there in space in a universe that was supposed to be billions of years old, and they're not being produced anywhere. And I'm only giving you this now because I want you to see the blind faith with which men swallow the evolutionary teaching that they get. They blindly accept that and say, well, there has to be an answer because we know there's not a God, so there must be another answer. So a man from the Netherlands, one of your people, he's proposed the idea years ago, a long time ago, he's dead now. He proposed, I was looking at you, but he proposed that there must be somewhere out there in the universe a pocket wherein comets are being created and they're being spit out into the universe and they're spreading out. He's never seen it. Like I say, he's dead now. He never saw it in his whole life. Nobody who he ever taught it to has ever seen it. Nobody who has ever lived has ever seen it because it does not exist. Now, I don't believe in it because there is no evidence of it existing other than comets. Here's the irony. I get what I'm saying and I realize that you have two alternatives. There is a God who created everything, or there is a pocket somewhere out in space creating comets that there's no evidence or sign of it other than the presence of comets. They tell you that you're foolish because you look at that same equation and you choose to say, well, I believe there's a God who created everything, instead of believing that there's an invisible pocket out there somewhere in the universe creating comets that nobody's ever seen, and the only evidence of it is that comets exist. But you think about it, as a Christian, like, our greatest evidence that there's a God that exists is the presence of the universe. The fact that it exists means it came from somewhere. And so we're foolish because we use that logic to say, well, then there must be a God. But they're okay to say that, well, no, it's all right. We know that there must be a comet creator out there because comets exist. It's the same exact logic, but you're a fool for believing one and they're wise for believing the other, even though they take it entirely by faith because there is no evidence of it. It has never been seen. It is just a theory that was made up by a man who did not want to believe in God. But if that was all, then you could see why they would believe what they believe. But there are so many things that can be seen and observed in our universe, things that should not be possible in a universe that are millions and billions of years old because they should have already been done. Like, it should already be that these things are finished. I mean, one here on the earth I would give you, and we'll see in a minute, God's the answer to this question. But the largest desert in the world is the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert, by anybody who's a scientist, typically believes it's a few thousand years old. But the reason why is because we have evidence that there was plant life and other things in it just a few thousand years ago. So everybody estimates it has to be less than about 5,000 years old, and there's a good reason for that, because about 5,000 years ago there was an event that it would have definitely been covered in water, because everything on the face of the earth was covered in water during that event. It's called the flood. And so that Sahara Desert, anybody who believes science will tell you that it has only existed for about 5,000 or less years. Now, if you don't know this, the way a desert expands is because of the way the winds are pushing the heat front through it. It dries out the land and spreads the desert. So the Sahara Desert is the largest desert. It wouldn't have started that way, though. It would have started very small, and over the past few thousand years, it would have expanded. So if the largest one in the world is only a few thousand years old, why is there no desert larger than that? Why is there no desert in the entire world that has expanded for millions of years, or for tens of thousands of years, or 50,000 years? Why has that never happened? Why is there only the one that we know it can't be more than about 5,000 years old, because there's evidence of it having plant life not so long ago? But the logic it escapes the person who wants to deny God, because they're not actually looking at it logically. They're grasping in the darkness because they're afraid to look at the light, desperately trying to find anything they can hold on to that keeps them from turning to God. So instead of believing that the logical answer is there's a God who created everything and it's all the age that He says it is, and there's a good reason why everything matches His story, is to come up with theories that, well, there's a pocket somewhere out in space that creates comets, That there must have been some reason why that desert is not that, or maybe it's millions of years old and those plants, somebody put them there. I don't know. But they'll come up with any silly theory they can come up with. You have things as simple as understanding that when we first went to the moon, it was estimated there would be between 10 and 15,000 years worth of dust accumulated upon the surface of the moon. And yet, when we landed on it, they say it was only a few thousand years. I'm sorry, it was estimated. Sorry, millions of years was estimated. When they landed on it, we estimated it's less than 10 to 15,000 years of dust accumulated. It could be as little as 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000, somewhere in that area. So why would you explain that? Like, how do you answer that as someone who doesn't believe in God and believes the universe is millions of years old? Did somebody come and vacuum all the dust from the moon? I mean, we don't have an answer for so many things in our world that if we simply believe God, it's answered. It's been answered. It was answered a long time ago. But the equivalent of what we have today and what's taught in the modern classroom and what is taught in a lot of religions nowadays is the idea of what was taught in Hinduism and all those religions of the past, wherein the world was sitting on the back of a giant tortoise, it was on the back of 4 elephants, the elephant was on the back of the snake, and the snake was in the cosmic sea. And if you don't know what I mean by that, the ideology was that somebody said it was on a tortoise, somebody said, well, what's the tortoise on? They said, well, it's on 4 elephants. They said, well, what's the elephant on? The elephant's on a snake. Well, what's the snake on? What's in the giant cosmic ocean? Why? Because they couldn't understand the logic of where the world come from and how it was floating so setting like it is in space. How could that happen? And so their idea was to make up that a man was holding it or that it was setting upon something. And anybody with wisdom can look at that and say, well, then what's the ocean floating in? Like, there has to be a limit to this, but they can't understand or get to that. And men today who just keep saying one universe exploded, one imploded, back and forth over and over again, are doing the same exact thing, denying what is clear in front of them. That most of the things in the universe point to the fact that it can't be that old. The size of the sun tells us it can't be that old. The presence of stars, because stars are dying but none are being created, it tells us that it can't be that old. There are so many things around us that we can see that everything's pointing to a universe that was created and is now dying for some reason. The Bible gives you an answer to that. Because God created a perfect creation and put it in man's hands, and man created a big problem when he fell in sin and he broke that creation. It'd be like me giving you a machine that's perfect, it'll run forever, and then the first thing you do is stick a wrench in the gears and you destroy it. And God said from this point on there will be thorns coming from the ground, animals will be harmful, there will be poison, there will be all this stuff. You'll die, you'll work by the sweat of your brow, women will suffer throughout the birthing process. All these things and complications will come because by one man's sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And why does it seem like there's a sudden reset about 5,000 years ago? I mean, think about this. The average scientist says that, or not scientist necessarily, but historian says that written language is traced back to about 5,000 years ago. That before that, there was no evidence of a written language. Now, we know that men were smart well before 5,000 years ago. I mean, before the flood, they were already making stuff out of metal and making instruments and all this kind of stuff. If you don't believe in God and you believe in evolution, then you believe that men were smart before 5,000 years ago, enough to build societies and stuff. So why did we only learn how to write 5,000 years ago? Why is it there's no evidence of a written language before then? Could it be that there was an event that God describes that wiped out the entirety of human civilization, and there's only a few things that stand? And ironically or interestingly enough, most of those are covered with erosion marks wherein water would have ran across the surface of them. You just think about it. Like, you don't have to be smart to realize that everything around you is pointing to God being correct. The reason why people deny this is not because God is incorrect. It's not because God doesn't make sense. It's simply because the alternative is that there is a God, and they don't want to buy that. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to believe it. But all the evidence is showing you this. So for you and I, we have to step back and look at what God says He did, and we have to choose, do we believe Him or not? Because if you believe Him, all the universe is showing you the evidence that He is the powerful Creator who spoke it into existence. That it didn't come about little, by accident and by chance across billions of years, infinite time and infinite realities and infinite possibilities and infinite universes and whatever they want to put in there to try to make their equation work. Because you understand that infinite time is not enough, infinite possibility doesn't even work. Somewhere in all of that, there has to be the understanding that there must be a creator. But the world is so desperate to understand it that they'll come up with multiverses, they'll come up with everything to try to do anything but believe in God. And God says in Hebrews 11 and verse 3, it's by faith that we understand that God created the heavens and the earth. You understand? It's by faith that we believe and understand this. You and I are able to let God explain Himself to us because we don't approach Him saying, I don't believe you, there's no evidence of you. We approach Him saying, okay, God, you've never been wrong about anything else. Let me understand a little bit better how you created this whole thing. Let me understand a little bit better what you did. And when we come to Him with that openness, that willingness to be taught, wherein by faith we understand what He has created, where by faith we can see something that is not visible to us, the actual act of creation, we begin to look at the evidence around us and we begin to see it. We begin to be able to see what God has done because we come to Him by faith and not as someone who is so opposed to God that we wouldn't believe the evidence that was right in front of our face. And that's really the difference. If you're asking me the difference between the Christian and those people who hate God, who would do anything to make you deny God, it's that simple. You are somebody who came to God and was willing to let God show you who He is. You were interested to know Him, and so He lets you see who He is. And little by little, you've learned to trust Him more and more. The reason why they don't trust Him is because they don't want to trust Him. It's not that there's a lack of evidence. It's not that He's untrustworthy. It's not that there's something wrong with God and there's a reason for them to be this way. It's simply because if there is a God, then they must answer to that God and they must understand and believe there's an eternity and they will give an account to Him when this life is over. And it's easier for them to pull the blanket over their head like someone who heard an intruder come into their house at night and would rather pull the blanket over their head and just hope that the noise goes away than to deal with the reality that someone's in their house. That's what these people are doing. Judgment is coming. Heaven is real. Hell is real. Eternity is real. All of it is real, and all the evidence around you shows you that. It shows you that there is a God who is so wise and so powerful that at the sound of His voice, all of this exists, and they would rather pull the blankets over their head and pretend like judgment's not coming. Like there's not something real and big and important that they have to deal with. They're burying their head because they don't want to deal with it. And that's all it is. That's why evolution is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the light. They always tell you that Christianity is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark, but that is not true. The reality is that atheism, evolution, and so many of the religions in the world today are a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the light. Because men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. That's really what it's all about. They would rather be allowed to hide their eyes and continue in their sin than believe that there's a God who cares about all of this that they'll have to answer to. Because all the evidence, if we look, God says, points to us that there is a God. Let me read you some passages here. Psalm 33, verse 6 through 9. Psalm chapter number 33, verse 6 through verse 9. It says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of His mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea together as an heap, and He layeth up the depth in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord, all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of Him. For He spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. If you can believe that, then you see truly how powerful God is. That the entirety of this universe, all the powers and forces, whether they be visible or invisible, that you and I can barely understand, much less have any power over, God says at the sound of His voice they all exist. That He didn't have to work by the sweat of His brow to produce them. He didn't rest on the seventh day because He was tired. He rested because it was finished. To rest in that sense means He was done. Creation is finished. There's nothing else to be created. When He talks about creating in me a new creature, a new heart, or those things, He's talking about renewing the one I have, taking it and remaking it. But the actual act of taking nothing and making something, God said it's done. It's all that needs to exist is done. That first day when He spoke and He created the heaven, He created space. Then when He created the earth, He created matter. He created the things that are filling space. And when He said, let there be light to divide the day from the night, He created time. The universe itself and all three phases in which it exists was created that day simply by God saying, let it be. At the sound of His voice, and He said with His fingertips, He stretched out the heavens like a tent to lay over top of us. He says that He is the one who hung the earth in space, that it hangs upon nothing. It floats freely there. He hung it upon nothing. He's the one who did that. It's His power that orchestrated all of that. And that's why so many of the planets don't adhere to the laws of physics. I mean, you understand that by the nature of the Big Bang Theory, every planet should be turning the same way, every moon should be turning the same way, and yet we find all across the universe that that's not true. Why? Because they didn't get created by the power of physics, they got created by the power of God. It was by His voice and His power that He spoke. And I know you know that because I've said that so many times before, but I want to make sure you get that today, that it wasn't as simple as, yeah, they're just there. No, God spoke and it's His power that created them. It was not the natural laws of physics. That's why the universe doesn't exist the way that you and I would understand by physics, but by the power of God. And what I mean is that naturally everything works. Like it adheres to the laws that God has ordained and has set up, that He's the one who put them in place. And He says He's the one who put them in place. Everything falls in perfectly with that. But it all begins with the power of His voice. And that's why there is no explanation other than that. Anything else you try to explain, you try to explain that it exploded and it moved faster than the speed of light, well, that's not physically possible. That's a law of physics. It can't happen. Can God create and stretch it with His fingertips faster than the speed of light? Yes, He can. Why? Because if He has power to create something from nothing, then the laws of physics will bend at His will, just like when He walked on the water, just like when He calmed the sea at the sound of His voice, just like when He did anything else to exhibit His power over the laws of physics. Just like when He took a boat that was in the midst of the sea, and the moment He stepped into it, it says they're on the other side of the sea. Nothing in the laws of physics and the laws of nature or science have power over Him. They are the commandments which He has put over this world to keep it running. And that's why I'm going to jump past a lot of verses. I have several verses here, Colossians 1, 16 and 17, where we're told, for by Him all things were created that are in the heaven and that are in the earth, that they're created by Him, and by Him they exist, or consist, is the word used. And then we have Isaiah 40, verse 21 through 22, where He compares Himself to the idols, and He says, does not the universe teach you? Does not nature teach you? Do not the animals, do not all these things teach you that God's not an idol, that you have to come up with some story of how the universe created Him? He is the one true and living God who created the universe. So much of the religions that have existed throughout time are men teaching how that their God was created by the elements, was created by nature. But we have a God who declares Himself as the Lord over all of that and says He created it all, that there was nothing until He spoke. So you and I have to understand that about God, and then we can appreciate what He's saying here. That it's His power that they exist, and it's His power that they consist. That's what he was saying in Colossians, that all things were made by Him, and all things consist by Him as well. Meaning the power that holds them together, that keeps them existing day in and day out, is His power, it's His laws that He has placed upon this universe to keep it functioning. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. Hebrews 1, verse 2 and 3. Let me give you this verse, and then I'll get to some more examples. But Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2 and verse 3 says, hath in the last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds, who being the brightness of His glory and the express image of His person, and upholding all things by the word of His power, when He had by Himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high. So you see, we know no question that Jesus is the Creator. We see it in John 1, we see it in Colossians, we see it here in Hebrews, we see it multiple times, that Jesus is the one who carried out the act of creation. But I want you to notice that phrase, and after it says, express Him as His person, and upholding all things by the word of His power. It is the power of God that holds the universe together. The reason why the oceans don't overtake the land is because God created it in such a way that when He put the commandment upon it, there was no power in the universe that could make them do it. You see, I'm not saying that there's not natural forces that explain all of this. Of course there are. Because God put those things in place. He ordered it and structured it. That's why He says by wisdom He created it and by understanding He founded it. It's His understanding that has put these laws in place and made things to function the way that they do. But you understand it's His power that set this in motion, and it's His power that keeps it all turning. The reason why we don't have to worry about whether or not we're going to destroy the world because somebody flew too many jets or you had too many cows in the Netherlands or whatever nonsense they come up with this week as to why next year acid rain will wipe out the earth. Oh, that didn't happen, so next year it's we're going into a second ice age. Oh, next year that didn't happen, so it's going to be global warming. Oh, that's not happening. So let's just call it climate change, so we don't have to change it every few years. You understand the reason why that keeps happening over and over again. There's some reason why the world's going to end and it never comes, and they just come up with a new excuse and a new reason. It's very simple. They look at the world around us and they realize that while God did institute it with natural laws that should keep it turning, sin broke it, and it is breaking down, so that God says things will wax worse and worse, not just with society but with the planet itself. Things are getting worse over time. And so we understand that it's going to break down. It's the law of physics as well. And God set all that in motion. But the reason why, even though we look at it and we can see that it doesn't make sense, it should be slowing down, it should be breaking, it should be stopping, things should be going worse than what they are, is because there is a God who by His power not only created it, but sustains it and will sustain it until the day that He comes and Himself pours out His wrath upon it and the heavens be melted away with a fervent heat. He says the heaven and earth shall pass away, but His word will not pass away. You understand? He has set His promises. He has set His commandments. He has His Bible. He has all these things, and He says they're not going to pass away. The earth will, but not till He said it will. So you can get your electric car. I'm not against you having an electric car, but just understand that your electric car has no impact whatsoever on whether or not the earth will be here another 1,000 years if Jesus doesn't come back. It may affect what the environment's like in Belgium. I'm not saying you don't have a local effect. We've seen that in plenty of places in the world, that people could change what their local environment is like by just taking a little better care of it. But we've also seen things that we said couldn't be heal within 5, 10, or 30 years or less than 5 years. We've seen it sometimes as little as a year. Things like the hole in the ozone layer and all this stuff, we see them heal in no time when we just fix what's causing them. Well, science said it should take longer. Our logic said it should take longer. Why did it happen so fast? Because there's a God who by Him all things exist and consist. There's a God whose power is what upholds all of this and keeps it together. It's not just simply the laws of nature. Yes, He put those in place, and He teaches us that in the Bible. But it's deeper than that. There's a reason why you could not destroy this planet if you wanted to. You will not be able to, because God is the one who's holding all of this together. And He will continue to do so until the day that He sees fit to pour out His judgment upon it and the heavens and earth melt away with a fervent heat. And again, everything around us shows us that. The fact that over and over again we see these problems, and in 5 years the polar ice caps are going to melt and all the world's going to be flooded and there'll be no dry land left for you to live on and all of this. Well, God says more than once in the Bible, in Proverbs 8, that He gave the commandment to the sea to not overtake the land. Proverbs 8, 23 through 29, He talks about that, how He established the worlds and how He set them in their place, and that in the midst of setting all these things in their place and saying that the waters are going to work like this and the land's going to be like that, He gave a commandment to the sea that it would not overtake the land. That's Proverbs 8, 23 through 29. But then He also repeats that in Job 26, verse 7 through 14, where He actually explains it to you in more detail, how that God created all these things and He set them in their place, and He created the water cycle so that the rain goes up and it comes down and so forth. And He set it so that all these things would run perfectly like a machine running in motion. And in the midst of all that, He put a commandment on the sea that you will not pass the land. You will not overtake it. Here's another one of those examples of how everything points to there being a very short-lived universe. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the oceans get saltier. They're not getting less salty, they get more salty. Every year as the waves crash against the shore, they're pulling more and more salt into the oceans. And logically, based on the rate at which each ocean is increasing in salinity or saltiness, if we were millions of years old, the ocean should be like the Dead Sea, where nothing could live in it. It's so salty. It should be worse than that. Why is it the saltiest oceans in the world which, I mean, most of them are pretty well the same, but why is it the saltiest oceans in the world show no signs of being able to have existed more than about 5,000 or 6,000 years? The amount of salt that's in them could have been accumulated in less than 10,000 years. It's not possible that they were accumulating salt longer than that, or else they would be like the Dead Sea and life would not be able to exist in those places. I mean, you ever thought about that? Like, the logic is that just like the sun's shrinking, so it used to be bigger and it should have been big enough to destroy everything, the oceans are getting saltier. So if they were older, they should be more salty and salty enough that life could not exist on the earth unless they suddenly somehow decided to get more salty in the time we've been checking them. The whole time we've been checking them, the rate's consistent. So my point is that all these things are showing you that there is a world, it was created by God's power, and by His power it continues to exist. It can't be more than a certain amount of time that it's breaking down, but He's holding it together. And the only reason it doesn't fall apart faster is because He is holding it together. And it will be held together until He's done doing so and He pours out His wrath on it. Everything is pointing you to that. And that's why we can say that we don't do something, the temperatures are going to raise and the ice caps are going to melt, and in just a few years the water levels will be raised so high that we can't live places like this anymore because it's going to be flooded because we're so close to sea level. And yet you can go back to Plymouth Rock, the first place where the many settlers reached to the U.S., and they picked a little rock there by the coast, just a small little rock, and they engraved it and said, this is going to be the landmark showing where we landed. And from 1700s until now, the water level is the same at that rock. It's still right there at water level when the tide's in its normal phase, not high nor too low. The water comes right up to the edge of that rock and touches it just like it did 200 some years ago. I mean, think about that. You've been told your entire life that the water levels are raising and that the world's going to be overpopulated, and yet we can fit the entire population of the world in just a small little space. Like, I mean, you understand, like we could all, there's states, not even the entirety of the U.S., there's states within the U.S. that the entire population of the world could move there and have a little piece of land to live in, and it wouldn't make a difference. Like, we all could live there and have our farms and live, and the rest of the world go uninhabited. All these people preaching to you overpopulation, all the people preaching to you that the environment is breaking up and that the world is going to flood and that the ozone's going to give out and all this kind of stuff, do so because they don't believe in a God, and they ignore the clear evidence that He's holding it together. That everything they have preached, as long as they've been preaching it, has never come to pass. It's like the Jehovah's Witnesses. You have the Watchtower Society, and over they prophesy this person's going to come back at this time, and this one's coming back at this time, and this is going to happen. And they've never got a prophecy correct in all the time they've existed. There's entire websites dedicated to showing you how that they've never got a prophecy correct. Even Wikipedia has a page of their prophecies that have never come to pass. And the world laughs at them and mocks at them because how foolish would you have to be to believe that? And then they believe, people who tell you, okay, well in the 70s it was acid rain, in the 80s it was this, in the 90s it was this, in the 2000s, the aughts it was like this, in the 2010s it was like this, in the 2020s it's like this. And it's the same thing. It's just a prophecy of doomsday and prediction of how it's all going to end. And they laugh at Christians who believe the people who say the day of the rapture is this day, and they go prepare for the doomsday, and they're doing the same thing. And they believe it so wholeheartedly that they get offended that you don't agree with them. And it's their faith in this religion that has been proven wrong over and over again, but yet they believe it to the point that they would persecute you and cast you out of society for not believing their religion. And yet you're the one who's foolish for believing a God who has literally never been wrong. Like, you can never find anything that He has said that was wrong. Every word that He has ever said has come to pass. He has never missed one prophecy. He has never missed one prediction. Not one commandment has ever failed. They're all there perfectly. The sea has not overtaken the land, no matter how many times they said it would, because it's by God's power that it exists, and it's by God's power that it consists. God's the one who holds it all together. I wanted to get into something about what the animals and how that we can see it in there as well, but that'll fit perfectly into where we have to pick up next week, so I'm not going to get into that today. I just want you to look at creation and understand that everything around you speaks to the fact that there is a God who made the heavens and the earth, and if you can believe He created it, then you should be able to see that He's the one holding it together, and there is no need to doubt Him now. There is nothing He has ever been wrong. There's not one thing He's ever told you that you can't look at the world around you and see it and see that, oh, no, He was wrong about that one. Everything He has ever told you, if you just look out your window, you can see He was right about that. And His power is on display in front of you every single day of your life. The fact that this world consists exactly as He said it would and exists exactly as He said it would is evidence to you every day of your life that there is a God who is powerful enough and wise enough to govern your life and take care of you and meet whatever needs you have, and can be trusted because He has never lied to you yet, and He never will. Father, we thank You and praise You, God, for what You do. We pray that You'll watch over us, help us to serve You, Lord. Thank You for Your blessings, for Your goodness. I just pray, Father, that You would take what's been said here today, that You use it to speak to the hearts of each person. I pray maybe, God, someone who comes across this message hasn't had the willingness to listen to You, believe You, that, God, maybe their hearts might be found open and receptive this time so that they'd be willing to hear You and Your word. We thank You, God, for all this, and we ask it in Your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.